Since the foundations of America, there have been three main factors that have had influence in a big evolution within the American society. I would like to start with race, as skin color was one of the first distinctions in America. According to History.com, the first African slaves were brought to the U.S. in the year 1619. Slaves were taken from their countries and forced to serve a master. They were put on ships and taken to America in the worst possible conditions, and these conditions are reflected in the following quote from Alexander Falconberg's account of the slave trade, when he says, "The place allotted for the sick Negroes is under the half-decks, where they lie on bark planks. By this means, those who are emaciated frequently have their skin and even their flesh entirely rubbed off by the motion of the ship, from their prominent parts of the shoulders, elbows, and hips, so as to render the bones quite bare." After their arrival, they were simply put on sale, and a person was the owner of this person who was free on his or her land weeks ago. With the abolition of slavery in 1865, slaves were free, but free had a different meaning for white and black people. Race discrimination didn't end with the end of slavery. If we analyze the evolution of class and race in the 20th century and take a close look on the Great Depression of 1929, we can see how much Americans suffered during this period if we listen to Studs Terkel's Great Depression interview in his first act, when he says, "I remember when the times were so hard, the sheriff pawned the radio to my father for $10. This was a white sheriff, a white official, that had to come to a black man to get $10. In this part of the interview, we don't only see the economic crisis that the country was going through, but how racial discrimination against African Americans were still part of the society. But the crisis was so hard that white people had to forget about racial problems, at least when it was to their convenience. The so-called nigger was seen as inferior for so many years. We can see how almost 100 years after the abolition of slavery, in 35 years after the Great Depression, James Baldwin on his clip, "Who's the Nigger?" says, "Now here in this country we've invented something called a nigger." We have invented the nigger? I didn't invent him. White people invented him. I've always known. I had to know by the time I was 17 years old. What you were describing was not me. And what you were afraid of was not me. It has to be else. Something you were afraid of, you invested me with. So I give you your problem back. You're the nigger, baby. It isn't me. The idea of African Americans as inferior and evil human beings was so intrinsic in the core of the American society that the suffering and injustice didn't stop when African Americans were left alone in their countries and not obligated to do the jobs that white people didn't want to do to make the economy great. No, it didn't stop when white people were forced to stop making these human beings to work until death if necessary. It continued for years. With the civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s, there was a great change in the perception of African Americans, and luckily, today there's no difference in civil rights based on skin color, but there's still some people who unfortunately discriminate against that. Class in America had a different evolution based on race and gender. We can see how in the 1800s there was a possibility for people with economic opportunity to show off in social groups. People with economic opportunity, of course, meaning white people. We can see it reflected on this image. Women of privileged classes could wear dresses like this one, and we can contrast this picture with this sharecropping family from the year 1900. Based on a study from the Vanderbilt University called Employment Segregation in the early 20th century, in the year 1940, the average annual earning of a black man were about 48% of the average earnings of a white man. In the year 1980, the black to white male earnings ratio equaled 61%, meaning that in the 40s, between the 40s and the 80s, there's a 13 percentage points of difference. Instead of lowering that gap between the white earnings and the black earnings, they increased by 13 points. It is important to mention that the difference in social classes didn't only affect the black people. there were also many white people that were poor and struggling. If we go back to the Great Depression, less fortunate people couldn't owe anything because they didn't have the means to pay for it, and they couldn't pursue an education to be able to step up for themselves. We can see, how this also increases the gap not only between the white and the black, but also between the rich and the poor. The rich being a small percentage of the country and the poor being the majority of it. If we go back to Stuart Circle, we can see how a white official had to go back to a black man to ask for money. And we can see in this picture of Walker Evans to Allie Mae in the year 1936. We can see the signs of aging in this woman. She's only 27 years old and she looks much older for the struggles and the depression on this era, this time. If we read the article Walker Evans' picture of Allie Mae Boros in 1936 by Mary Pearson, she says her young face, aged prematurely by the work, anxiety, and hardship of life in the Depression in the Deep South in the 1930s, has come to symbolize the struggle of sharecroppers' families and their families. According to the article Married Woman Property Laws, before the Civil War, married woman property laws were concerned with equity procedures, focusing on the appropriate pleadings a wife should use to file a suit, but not altering a husband's privileges granted by prior common law principles. After the Civil Wars, these laws ranged from the simple ability of wives to write wills, with or without their husband's consent, to granting femme sole status to abandoned women, to allowing women some control over their own wages, to establishing separate states for women, to protecting land inherited by widows from their husband's creditor, to allowing widows legal access to their husband's personal estates. All this from married women's property laws. The evolution of gender in America, as we can see, has had a long history since the beginning of our nation. In the book The Art of Cookery from Amelia Simmons, from the year 1798, by the way, the first book written in America, she mentions an universal knowledge of these females in this country who, by the loss of their parents or the unfortunate circumstances, are reduced to the necessity of going into families in the line of domestics and doing those things which are really essential to perfecting them as good wives and useful members of societies. To be a useful member of society, a woman had to be a good wife. The institution of marriage was, instead of a fair relationship between two people, a concept of property where women belonged to men and they had to serve them, raise the children, and comply with sexual activities. We can also see how in the article The Peculiar Responsibilities of American Women from Mrs. Catherine E. Beecher, she characterizes the way women are seen in America in the year 1842. She says, American women never managed to outwork concerns of the family, or conduct business, or take part in political life, nor are they, on the other hand, ever compelled to perform the rough labor of the fields, or to make any of those laborious exertions. The way this manifesto is put together convinces women that they're weaker, they should not get involved in any physical work or actively participate in politics, business, economy, or take actions in society. Women are held responsible for taking care of the husband, the children, and the house in exchange for the commodities that the society gave them. Taking small steps during the 20th century, women won many battles in their fight for civil rights, including fair employment opportunities, paid maternity leave, affordable child care, no-fault divorce laws, and overall, they gained the place they deserved in society. However, there's still many people who believe that women are inferior, that they should not be given any power, and the fight for women's rights is an ongoing battle that is still taking place in this country. I would like to conclude by saying that there's no perfect society. In communism, capitalism, and slavery, there's always a social class that suffers, or a gender that suffers, or a race that suffers. The future of humanity should be based on love and compassion, instead of based on hatred and insensitivity, as it has been until now. Thank you.